All right, well, thank you everybody for coming in this afternoon, fighting off your food coma, listening to us talk about the scourge of the internet right now, malicious crypto mining. As far as who I am, my name is Nick Biasini. I'm a threat researcher with Cisco Talos. A little bit of background, I've been in security now for, 15 years. Basically all of it has been in SOC environments up until my time doing threat research. I got my start as an analyst in a 24/7 SOC. Over the years, I was an analyst, lead analyst, managed teams of analysts, IPS engineer, SIM engineer. I am a proud non-coder. I don't code, will never code. I make horrible scripts that do things inadequately.
And just a little bit about me. My name is Edmund. I'm also a security researcher with Cisco Talos. So I've spent the past decade in information security, doing mostly digital forensics, incident response, malware analysis. I've held pretty much every position in a SOC that you can have prior to coming to Talos and starting my role as a security researcher. So just a couple things about me. I love malware, so that's what we do. We're constantly monitoring the threat landscape, ripping apart new threats that we're seeing in the wild, figuring out how attack methodologies are changing over time, and then making sure that customers are protected. So I'm also a huge music fan, specifically punk rock is kind of my jam. So definitely love to talk to folks about that as well. So over the past 6 to 12 months or so, we've seen a significant shift across the threat landscape. So over the past few years, right, ransomware has been one of the primary payloads of choice for most commodity malware distributors, right? So they'll use spam botnets for mouse spam campaigns, exploit kits for web-based attacks, active network exploitation, and typically the goal is to ransom data stored on systems. But over the past 6 to 12 months, we've seen a shift in the use of malware payloads in the wild. So all of those same vectors that have historically been used for malware distribution have started to be used to drop malicious cryptocurrency mining malware on systems. And we've seen this across the board. We've seen a significant reduction in the types of different types of payloads that are being dropped, and at this point it seems like attackers are starting to shift to kind of a more passive revenue generation model through the use of stealing cycles on other folks' systems for the purpose of generating cryptocurrency. So we've done a lot of research in monitoring and ripping apart a lot of the different malware distribution campaigns we've seen. So we're pretty familiar with Monero at this point. If you're not familiar already, Monero is an alternative cryptocurrency. Everyone knows about Bitcoin. It's all over. But we've seen attackers typically try to mine and generate Monero versus Bitcoin, and we'll kind of walk through why that is a little bit later in the presentation. There's a couple of different factors that make Monero much more attractive to cyber criminals than Bitcoin. So why did we put this talk together, right? Well, we've seen this shift, and organizations need to be aware of it, not just reading headlines that talk about crypto mining worms and stuff like that, but actually walk through what these attacks look like. It looked very similar to what we've seen from commodity malware for years and years and years, except instead of the resultant payload being banking Trojan or click fraud malware, we're seeing an increase in the use of cryptocurrency mining malware. We wanted to raise awareness and walk through some things that you can actually look for within an environment to very, very quickly identify when systems have been compromised and start generating revenue for attackers by mining Monero. So what are we going to be covering today? Well, we're going to start out by talking about Monero in general so that everyone has an understanding of why attackers are targeting Monero versus Bitcoin versus other cryptocurrencies that are out there. We're going to talk about how mining and mining pools actually work. So this isn't going to be math heavy. We're not going to walk through specific algorithmic problems that are being solved by mining clients to generate cryptocurrency, but at a high level, how attackers are leveraging mining and mining pools to generate revenue. We're also, as I mentioned, going to talk about things that defenders can do within their environment to mitigate these sorts of risks. A lot of it is following the same best practices from a network security architecture perspective that we've been preaching for the past several decades, but there are some distinct characteristics associated with cryptocurrency mining malware that are really easy to spot if you are looking for the right things. All right, so let's start out by talking about Monero. So what is Monero? Right, everyone's familiar with Bitcoin. At this point, there's a ton of different alternative cryptocurrencies out there. It's just another form of magic internet money, right? You solve complex mathematical problems and you may result in the creation of new cryptocurrency, in this case Monero. It seems like every week we're seeing new initial coin offerings being announced for a lot of different projects that are attempting to get into the cryptocurrency market and generate support. Monero is one of the most successful cryptocurrencies out there, and as a result, it's attractive for attackers. So just a little background on Monero. It was actually launched in April of 2014. So one of the unique things about Monero is that it's specifically concerned with security and privacy and provides different functionality to users of Monero that aren't available with cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin. It's fungible. Coin history can't be used to ban coins or anything like that. And similar to Bitcoin, it was actually created by an unknown person. So let's talk about how the mining actually works as it pertains to the Monero cryptocurrency. So it's based on the Cryptonite proof of work hashing algorithm. It's designed to be fairer than some of the other cryptocurrencies out there, specifically when compared to Bitcoin. The developers behind this particular cryptocurrency project have specifically made the decision that they do not want to price out standard computers in terms of being able to generate revenue through mining cryptocurrency. And there's default obfuscation techniques that are built in, not selected by the user, and they provide additional benefits to attackers that are using this cryptocurrency. So I mentioned it. Monero uses as a proof of work system. Other cryptocurrencies use proof of stake. And there's some distinct differences between these two types of hashing algorithms, but it's really simple. So just to break it down, proof of work dictates that the resources that you expend performing the mathematical calculations when you're mining have a direct impact on the amount of cryptocurrency that you can generate. With proof of stake systems, the amount of cryptocurrency you already control impacts how much cryptocurrency you can generate. So it's pretty important distinction. For the purposes of this talk, at the end of the day, when you're mining Monero, the number of systems and the number of resources that you have available and under your control directly translates to the amount of revenue you can generate through mining Monero.
All right. I'm going to jump in and talk a little bit about CPU, GPU mining. So if you're mining Bitcoin and you're not using ASICs, just stop. You're not making any money. It's just not worth it anymore. The big thing about Bitcoin is that it is the hardware-specific ASIC just completely dominates that landscape, which is one of the reasons why we don't see adversaries going after it. Monero, on the other hand, is much more beneficial to this. As Edmund just said, it's been specifically designed to be able to be used and will always work with commodity CPUs and GPUs. And as such, bad guys are much more interested in it, not surprisingly. So yes, the basics, ASIC resistant. So what I mean by that is ASICs are specialized hardware that are designed specifically for a purpose. In this case, specifically designed usually to mine Bitcoin or cryptocurrencies in general, right? The way that Monero is built is it ensures that CPU and GPU mining is always going to be profitable. It will always generate money. It's a very, very attractive way to get people to constantly mine and prevent these huge farms of ASICs dominating a massive amount of the mining capabilities for a particular cryptocurrency. And at its core, it's the same as any other cryptocurrency, right? You're just doing math. You're completing calculations, you're solving puzzles, that's how you generate your currency. It's all the same, it's just how they prioritize the things you can do it on. Now, one of the most interesting things about Monero is they're actually, in February, they announced that they're going to be continually updating the proof of work. So the whole idea here is to ensure that that threshold stays low. They're going to continue to change and alter the algorithms and the things that they're doing to make sure that average people will always be able to generate revenue. This actually just happened a month or so ago. So today, it's easier and more profitable to mine Monero than it was a month and a half ago because of these constant evolutions that they're going to do to make sure that the barrier stays low so that people remain interested and they'll always be able to use the commodity CPUs and GPUs to generate revenue. So this is kind of an overview slide of all the things associated with Monero and Bitcoin, how they're the same and how they're different. They are very similar. The biggest differences are the asig resistance and the fact that they're always altering the proof of work. They're always going to make sure that they're doing the commodity devices are always going to work and always going to generate revenue. They do also continually grow. That is one big difference. Like with Bitcoin, there's a set amount of Bitcoin, right? There's only this many. Monero it continues to grow. There'll always be more Monero available. That's one of the limitations of Bitcoin that we don't see in Monero. But the big difference is privacy. Everybody talks about the privacy associated with Bitcoin, but the ledger is public. So you can see all transactions, right? You can trace transactions until your heart's content. However, with Monero, you can't see anything. There is zero visibility into transactions. The wallets are basically, you can't get any of that privacy data. They took it to a much further place than where Bitcoin ever was. And again, the reason adversaries like Monero is because you can mine it on CPUs and GPUs. That's just how it was designed to be done. So let's talk a little bit about malicious crypto mining, what we're really here to talk about. How is this being done? Why is it being done? How much money are they generating? How are they doing it? That kind of stuff. Not surprisingly, the real reason this has taken off is because cryptocurrencies are extremely valuable, way more so than they were a year ago. And adversaries, no matter what we think about them, are going to go where the money is. That's what motivates the overwhelming majority of malicious activity you see on the internet, right? They're just following where the money goes. And why are they going to deliver something like ransomware that has a lot of law enforcement attention? You have to maintain communication, you have to do command and control. There's a lot of additional steps. Whereas with a crypto miner, I can drop it and I don't care. You can take it away, doesn't matter, I'll just own another box. I don't have to maintain access, I don't have to communicate with you at all. It's a one-time, drop the malware, and just off you go. So a little refresher here. How do you get cryptocurrency? There's two ways you can do it. You can buy it from an exchange, or you can mine it. Now, before you go home and are like, oh, I saw about this Monero thing, I'm going to generate all the money in the world. Typical computer, 125 hashes a second, which calculates to a whopping 25 cents a day in Monero. It's not even worth the electricity it's going to cost you. However, bad guys don't pay for electricity, number one. Number two, they operate at scale. So when you start multiplying this out, you start to see why it's so attractive. With 2,000 systems, you're now generating $500 a day in Monero. We've seen botnets with more than 200,000 nodes in them. You do the math. That's a lot of money. That's the reason why this is becoming such a massive epidemic. There's just so much money to be made, and it's a much, much simpler process. So how do you do this? How does pool-based mining work? The whole idea here is you just basically need two things. You need a URL, or an address that is the pool that you're mining to, and you need a unique identifier. In this case, a worker ID. And you can see here, it can be like a giant string of random text like that. It could be an email address. It could be a username. It really depends on what pool you're mining to, how they're set up, all that kind of stuff. Now, one of the interesting aspects is we don't always see this, but there is a lot of capabilities in most miners that allow you to do some form of stealth, right? You can do things like limit the temperature of the CPU, limit the amount of CPU you're using, limit the times when it's running. What else? Oh, yeah, how many cores you use. There's a lot of things that they can do to try and minimize the identification. That being said, we've seen plenty of crypto mining campaigns that just do not care. They will just push your hardware till it melts, and it doesn't matter to them. I mean, there's mobile mining campaigns that melted phones because they just don't care. They don't care if your system dies as long as you generate revenue before the system runs out of gas. So basically what we saw is bad guys realizing Monero is the future, we're going to mine all the things. And I kid you not, it is literally being delivered in every single way possibly imaginable onto end systems. So let's talk a little bit about some of the patterns and things that we see. So this is a very typical mining pattern, right? It's a very clean wave. You can see that they're peaking, ebbing, and flowing during normal times of day. Usually they're trying to mine in off hours, doing simple things to try and evade the user saying, why is my computer running so slow? Why can't I do anything on it anymore? However, we do occasionally see patterns that are more like this. And this would be typically indicative, could be indicative of something like in-browser mining, something that's a little more sporadic, where you don't have, like this, you have a dedicated system that's mining for very long periods of time. This could be something that's only mining during short bursts. So you see these huge spikes and then drops to where it drops down to basically nothing.
Yeah, so as he mentioned, pretty much every vector that we see used for malware distribution is being used to push malicious mining clients out in pretty high quantities. The whole idea being that you push a mining client and you try to maintain persistence persistence on a system as long as possible, right? So same ways that commodity malware has for years, scheduled tasks, registry run key entries, WMI subscriptions, all of those same things are being used. A lot of the reason that attackers would leverage those stealth options, so controlling temperature, controlling AC, power status, and stuff like that, is because the whole idea is you infect enough systems to reach a daily or monthly revenue generation level, and then you try to maintain persistence on those systems for as long as possible, because it makes it so you don't have to go out and reinfect systems every day because they're being found by organizations because their server farms are not falling over. The idea is if you can infect a specific set number of systems, whatever your revenue generation goals are, you can set it, forget it, and hope that you maintain those cycles as long as possible, because that's the whole passive part of the passive revenue generation model. Another thing that I'd like to point out is, with ransomware, one of the things that's just a nature of the sort of an approach is that there's a natural diminishing pool of available victims, right? So, initially when a user or victim gets infected with ransomware, they might be forced to pay a ransom if they don't have backups, they can't recover their data, there's no weakness in the encryption implementation of the ransomware. But at the end of the day, most people are going to get burned once, maybe twice, and then they'll probably have a pretty good backup and recovery strategy, which makes them not an ideal available victim for attackers. But if these same systems can be infected with crypto miners that remain under the radar for an extended period of time, they can continue to generate revenue for the attackers for a long time. There's no ransom note. One of the characteristics of ransomware, and one of the things that this revenue model relies on, is making the process of paying a ransom demand as easy as possible. So it requires extensive ransom notes. They have to have payment processing portals for processing the exchange of the decryption keys if they choose to even give those back. So there's a lot of ongoing care and feeding that has to be put into long-term ransomware campaigns, whereas with this, send out a mouse spam campaign, infect a bunch of hosts, and then generate revenue until they get cleaned up. So it's easy to see why this sort of a business model is attractive to cyber criminals. Even in the legitimate business space, people try to generate passive revenue whenever possible, and it's no different here. So let's talk about how these miners are actually being delivered. I wanted to walk through some specific examples just to show how these commodity malware distribution channels that we've seen used for years and years and years are now shifting those sorts of payloads. So here's an email example, right? Email's nothing new. Email's been abused by attackers for years and years and years, but here's a campaign where rather than pushing ransomware or a banking Trojan, the attackers were pushing malicious cryptocurrency mining software. So in this particular case, it was an email that was sent to a pool of victims where it claimed to be from somebody who was looking for a job. And the attacker basically said, hey, I'm looking for employment opportunities. Here's my CV. Please give me feedback. And attached to the email was a malicious Word document. So here's the Word document in this particular campaign, right? It looks very similar to decoy documents that we see all the time in malicious phishing campaigns. In this particular case, the malicious Word document actually functioned as a downloader. So in a lot of cases with this sort of malware distribution, the malware is not actually in the malicious file that's attached to the email. So when you open the file attachment and you enable macros in the case of Word, typically all that's in there is the code that's responsible for going out to an attacker-controlled web server, pulling down the actual malware, and then kicking it off to infect the system. And that's exactly what this particular document did. So once you enable content, enable macros, PowerShell would kick off and it would go out and grab this particular executable. So one of the things that the attacker did was they changed the file extension to make it look like it was benign. So imagine you're an analyst and you're in your SIM, you're looking at web-based events, that sort of thing, and you see this sort of a request. Maybe the fact that it has .jpeg at the end makes you think that it's a benign file, but in this case it was definitely a PE32 executable. So once the malware infects the system, right, the attacker has to kick that malware off to initiate the mining process, and they have to obtain persistence. So be able to kick off the miner again when the system reboots or things like that. In this particular case, the command line syntax that they used to kick off the malware initially and every subsequent time had those two same components that he was talking about earlier, right? So you've got the pool address so that the mining client knows where to connect to communicate the results of mathematical calculations and to kind of track the progress of the mining process. And then you've got the worker ID. It's a unique identifier. Typically, you wouldn't give this out, but since the attacker has to be able to facilitate receiving the Monero that's being mined, they have to encode this into all of the malware that they distribute. In this particular case, the worker ID has a .smoke11 at the end, and that's really just a way that if you're an attacker and you're pooling resources from 2,000 nodes in a botnet that you've created and you want to be able to uniquely identify them to see what sort of performance you're getting or identify which victims are finding and cleaning up the malware, you can use those sorts of unique identifiers that way. So here's how this particular campaign achieved persistence. Very, very similar to what we see from mouse spam campaigns all the time. In this case, they just used a registry run key that pointed to the mining client on disk, and then anytime the system's rebooted, those keys are read, those executables are then kicked off, and the mining process starts right up again. So that's an example of an email campaign. I could have walked through this exact same campaign, a year ago, and 95% of people would have guessed that this was a ransomware or a banking Trojan campaign, but that's the shift we're seeing, and it's a significant one. We're continuing to see new campaigns in the wild, and it's continuing to grow in frequency and popularity. So let's shift gears a little bit, and let's talk web. So I wanted to talk about some of the web-based campaigns that we've seen in the wild, right? So we've seen fake Flash player campaigns. Typically, those were always used for ransomware, banking Trojans. We're now starting to see those used for malicious cryptocurrency mining distribution. Also, RIG is an exploit kit. I wanted to walk through how we saw RIG distributing malicious cryptocurrency miners in the wild. So just a show of hands, who here is already very familiar with how exploit kits work? Okay, so a few. This will be kind of a refresher as far as that goes. So if you're not familiar with it, the online advertising industry nowadays is extremely disjointed, right? From the time you put a URL into the address bar and hit enter in your browser to the time a web page is displayed, there is a ton of activity that goes on the back end to determine, which advertisements are actually going to be displayed to you. So Nick could go to a website, a major news website. I could go to a major news website at the exact same time and be shown completely different ads. And that's because of a lot of the real-time auctioning and stuff that takes place, a lot of the targeting that advertising companies are choosing to do. But it makes it very attractive for cyber criminals because of all of the different moving parts and coordination that has to happen in near real time just to facilitate that process. So just to kind of put it in perspective, this is a connection map. This is all of the distinct connections that are made when you load a major news website nowadays. So gone are the days where you're just pulling down a few different elements and displaying the web page. But it's definitely easy to see how this would be attractive if a cyber criminal can find the weak spot somewhere in this advertising stream and insert malicious code. They can take advantage of that to compromise a lot of systems. So just at a high level, what is an exploit kit? So in most cases, when you browse a major website, and the ads are displayed, there's code that's executing that facilitates the display of whatever graphical content is associated with them. So the idea with a lot of the exploit kit campaigns that we see is that they'll basically find a way to insert code into an advertisement, and it's typically a 1 pixel iframe, so something that you can't see with the human eye. And typically they'll inject JavaScript. And all that JavaScript is responsible for is redirecting the client into the exploit kit's infrastructure. They'll usually bounce you through a few different servers, but ultimately you'll end up hitting what's called a landing page. And that landing page is typically responsible for querying the system, identifying what what version of Internet Explorer, what version of whatever browser is running, what browser plugins are installed, what versions of those are being used, what's the geographic location of the potential victim. So they find out all the information that they can from the client to try to make a determination. Is this an ideal candidate to try to exploit a vulnerability? So if the system hasn't been patched and there's an exploit that's been rolled into the exploit kit that takes advantage of that vulnerability, that might be an ideal client to try to compromise. And they'll typically, when they're successful at compromising the system, they'll typically use that access to drop malware. Historically, it's been ransomware, banking trojans, click fraud malware, but we've seen a significant increase in this sort of activity being used to distribute malicious cryptocurrency mining clients as well. So in this particular campaign, it starts with a gate. So this is that redirection code, the code that's responsible for the redirection process that I kind of mentioned before, right? It's just an iframe that points to the exploit kit's infrastructure and begins that redirection process that ultimately ends up with a potential compromise attempt. So at the end of the day, you hit that landing page. Don't worry about the code. It's been obfuscated by the attacker, but it does that querying process to profile the system to identify if there's an exploit available that they can make use of to get an initial foothold on a system. In this particular case, we could actually clearly see the system attempt to be compromised by the exploit kit in a controlled environment. But what was interesting about this campaign is it was actually a multi-payload campaign. So the system was successfully exploited, and the attackers chose to drop a smoke loader as the first stage of the infection process. So if you're not familiar with smoke loader, it's essentially a loader that's commonly used to load additional malware onto a system. So the attacker will drop smoke loader will register with the command and control infrastructure that the attacker controls. It'll send survey information about the system, and then from there the attackers can determine how they can best monetize their access, right? Maybe it's ransomware, maybe it's a banking trojan, or maybe it's cryptocurrency mining software. So here's the actual registration following the smoke loader infection. You can see it posting information out to the command and control server and receiving information back. That's that initial registration process. So in this particular case, they dropped a second payload, and it was a cryptocurrency mining client, which was interesting. And we've seen similar types of infection processes with ransomware in the past, right? They'll drop smoke loader or some other piece of malware, and they'll drop ransomware. And that's important because in a lot of cases, the victim may be able to clean up the ransomware. There may be a decryptor available if it's not been coded well. But by creating that diversion, the victim may never realize that there's a secondary piece of malware on their system, and the attacker can just drop right in and drop malware again. So once the malicious cryptocurrency mining client is on the system and it kicks off, what we typically see from this sort of mining client is that it'll go out and register with the mining pool, and then it'll continuously start to communicate with the mining pool, sending updates and things like that, and it uses JSON communications, which aren't encrypted on the wire, and it's something that's really easy to spot if you have rules in place that look for this sort of communications. So that's an example of a web-based attack. One of the other attacks I wanted to talk about was active network exploitation. So every time we see a remote code execution vulnerability that impacts a service or platform that's typically externally exposed in an organization, attackers are very, very quick to hop on that. It makes it even easier when exploit proof of concept code is publicly available. It just speeds up the process. It'll eventually happen anyways, but it significantly speeds that process up. So I wanted to talk about a specific example of that we saw over the past year or so. So towards the end of last year, beginning of this year, details came out about a remote code execution vulnerability that affected Oracle WebLogic. But what was interesting is that you can see on the slide the date of January 3rd, 2018. We saw public proof of exploit code get posted to ExploitDB. If you're not familiar, ExploitDB is essentially a repository where people can publish public proof of concept exploit code that can be used for pen testing or other sorts of testing activities like that. It's publicly available though, so it's also available to cyber criminals. What was interesting, so on the 3rd we saw this proof of concept code get uploaded to ExploitDB. And then what we saw was around the 9th there was a SANS ISC diary where they were reporting that across honeypot infrastructure they were seeing a significant spike in traffic around the internet on TCP port 3333. And they even included a map of what they were seeing from a connection standpoint. And you can see starting around the beginning of January there, saw a significant spike in traffic on that port. And what that port is that's one of the ports that the mining clients communicate to the mining pool over. So I get asked a lot when I talk to people, how quickly do we need to patch when things like RCEs are released or disclosed by vendors? And the answer is very, very quickly, because attackers will hop on these. And what they were doing was they were basically scanning the internet, looking for vulnerable WebLogic servers, and then exploiting this particular vulnerability and using that access to drop cryptocurrency mining software on the servers that were impacted. There was a significant number of these sorts of exposed servers on the internet, which makes it a big problem, but also allows attackers to very, very quickly hop on, exploit a bunch of systems, drop cryptocurrency miners, and immediately start to generate revenue. So one of the cool things about the mining pools is if you have that unique identifier, you can go straight to the mining pool and you can plug that worker ID into the mining pool, and they'll give you all sorts of historical information about the performance of this particular worker ID. So in this particular case, think a botnet under the attacker's control. And this is what the actual graph of the performance that they were getting from a hash rate perspective looked like over time. And at the time when we actually looked at this, we found that they had already been paid out about $150,000. And this is pretty quick revenue generation. Whenever you have that worker ID, you can see how much has historically been paid out to that worker ID as a result of mining and such. And so this was at time of slide creation. As most of you are probably aware of, the price of cryptocurrency is very, very volatile. And so it could be significantly different week by week. But when we put these slides together, it was at about 153,000 that this particular botnet had been generating. So the last example I want to talk about is mining worms, because these are interesting in that they're not looking at a one-to-one infection when they're targeting an organization. They'll infect patient zero, and then through the use of self-propagation, additional resources within the organization may be impacted. And in the case with mining worms, that can be significant, because if they don't choose to be stealthy and they just crank it up to 11 and start utilizing 100% CPU resources, that can cause a ton of legitimate services to start falling over. If you have database servers or other sorts of special role servers, if you get infected and this mine starts to propagate across your environment and starts to adversely impact all of those systems, the legitimate services in a lot of cases will start to fall over. And we've seen this. So one example was WannaMine, which was a worm that spread using Eternal Blue. There's another example where they were utilizing Android ADB. And then just a third example of the use of the Mirai botnet to begin generating Bitcoins with IoT devices. Interesting thing about IoT, there's a ton of them, but obviously they don't have a whole lot of system resources. So you're kind of playing the game of, I can infect more systems, in a lot of cases much easier, but it's going to take me a lot longer and a lot more systems to reach that revenue generation threshold that I want to be at. So we've talked about all of these distribution mechanisms, right? This is pretty much how ransomware has been being distributed for the past 3 or 4 years, and we're seeing that shift. But how much is this actually generating for the attackers? So here's just an example of another botnet that we were analyzing when we were doing this research. In this particular case, they had made about 120,000 USD. And just another example of a botnet where they had generated about 200,000. And here's another example where they had generated about 500,000. And so here's just a table of some of the other botnets that we went through when we were doing this research. But you can very quickly see how this would be an attractive business model for cyber criminals. There's not a lot of care and feeding. There's no C2 infrastructure necessarily needed for these campaigns. They're not having to directly communicate with victims to help them buy Bitcoin and transfer it to pay a ransom. And they can sit back and just let the revenue generate in a passive manner once they've reached that number of infected systems that they want.
All right, I'm going to talk a little bit about how they evolve, but just to put some final points on that. That table of 4 or 5 there were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of those types of campaigns going on. I mean, when that example of WebLogic happened, there was enough traffic generated to shift the global traffic profile for that port. Think about that. I mean, Internet Storm Center is looking at stuff at a very large scale, and they noticed a drastic shift in that. That is a lot of traffic and gives you an idea of how bad this is. But like any threat, as you gain more and more insight into it, the actors are watching what you're doing, they're watching what you're writing, and they're going to continue to change and evolve to try to get better. So let's see some of the stuff that they're doing. We've seen this a lot where they'll just hard code an IP instead of a domain. They're not being super clever though, because they just hard coded the IP to one of the pools, so it's not very sophisticated. But if you're doing things like domain blacklisting, this is going to get past it because it's not looking up the domain anymore. We've also seen them rolling their own, meaning they build their own aggregation point, right? They have their own pool that they set up that all the bots connect to, and then that ends up connecting out to a pool where they're generating more Monero revenue. And a lot of these you'll notice by the really simplistic users. Like you're not going to get a worker ID of 123 from a reputable pool. It's just not going to happen. That's not the way that this works. And then like here, ZJ, that's not, again, not a valid pool. But this is an effective way if, again, all you're doing is trying to block the IPs and domains of the pools, this will get past that. We've also seen things like this. This one was a little bit interesting. So they registered their own domain, and instead of pointing it to the IP address, they literally just forwarded it to the pool for mine XMR. This is yet another example of the ways that they go about doing this. Some, obviously, way more sophisticated than others. We do very rarely, occasionally, see them implementing some sort of encryption around it and trying to obfuscate the traffic, but that is far more often the exception than the rule. It's not something that we see commonly, just because from their perspective, it's not worth the overhead. If I'm going to get shut down, I'm just going to go pop another box. I don't care to take the effort to make sure it's encrypted so that you don't see it on the wire. So let's talk about fails. This is one of my favorite sections of this. We saw such a rapid adoption of this that bad guys did horrible implementations of it. My favorite, no, this isn't my favorite, but what we commonly saw was stuff like this, where they understand basically how it works, but they don't really understand that you have to have a worker ID. So they just left it, your wallet, your worker ID, your email, which doesn't do anything. So you have a massive botnet that doesn't work. My favorite one, though, by a wide margin, is the open source miner where the author decided to give you a generic configuration file that had their worker ID in it. So you could see kind of how this works normally. They didn't realize that you need your own worker ID to replace their worker ID, so they distributed a malicious crypto miner that was mining Monero for the guy who wrote the open source miner and generating absolutely no revenue for them. This is the type of stuff that we see time and time again. One other thing that we're seeing more and more of. You guys remember back in the days the toolbar supported stuff? So now we're seeing more and more what we'll call freeware that offers things like this. Like, hey, would you mind installing an XMR client to help support this awesome software product? And just like back in the day, check the box, don't check the box, you still get the XMR client installed on your system. Shocking, I know. What we're really going to end up with is the days like this again. This is where we're headed with crypto mining. I'm sorry to say, but it is everywhere. It is going to remain everywhere. It is going to be delivered in any way you can possibly imagine because it generates a massive amount of money. Bad guys took an economics lesson. They realized that, what's this bulk payout thing? I don't want just only 2% or 3% of the people I compromise to actually pay me, and I get one lump sum payment. Why not just move to a recurring revenue model? This way I can slowly make money over years as opposed to having to compromise 100 boxes and maybe get 3 people to pay a ransom off of it. So this is one of the biggest questions that we get. Are miners malware? So a lot of this goes with the way that these miners are delivered, right? You have to understand what was the intent? I mean, I don't know about you guys, but my typical methodology for installing software is not to write an obfuscated macro and pull it off the internet and install it automatically. That's not how I install my software. I mean, teach their own, but that's not really how I roll. And in an enterprise environment, this isn't even a question. it's malicious. If you don't explicitly allow it, it's malicious. It's not supposed to be there. It's against policy. There is no reason, unless your company really wants to make use of those spare CPU cycles to generate every last bit of money they possibly can, it's not allowed. And I got to tell you, we saw so many examples of people that were obviously installing miners on their desktops at work to try and generate money. I mean, it's a trivial amount of money, but people are just like, hey, all it takes is one sysadmin that's like, hey, I got access to all the servers in the data center. They're not really active at night. Maybe I can run a little script on the side to generate a little. We've seen that as well. That's just kind of the nature of this.
It's the new SETI at home.
Yes, that's exactly it. It's like the Ronco of threats. Set it and forget it. This stuff is going to be around for a very, very long time, and there are lots of ways to go about detecting it. Like Edmund said, the network traffic is probably one of the best. It's just always there, right? You're always going to have users, especially in an enterprise environment, that start opening tickets saying stuff like, my system's slow, or I can't get to this internal website anymore, or I can't do my job because of this or that. You're going to see systems that are running at 100% CPU 100% of the time, which is not normal typically. You'll see all kinds of the techniques that Edmund walked through, where you have registry keys getting dropped and different scheduled tasks coming up, and ways for them to establish persistence. In general, unless you are at home and you really want to mine Monero for your own benefit, consider it malicious, because you're not putting it there. Why would it be legitimate? It's one of the biggest questions that we have. And I love to end with this. This is just kind of a snapshot of how horrible and how bad this is going to be. So they had some Russian nuclear scientists working on a top secret nuclear program that decided, you know what we're going to do? We're going to take this super top secret supercomputer and figure out how to connect it to the internet so we can use it to mine Bitcoin. Think about that. What?
Here with American scientists, I'm CISO for open science group, just so you know.
Yes, because everybody's going to try and make Monero because everybody sees cryptocurrency in the news all day long, and they're, how do I get on that? How do I make that money? I got to make that extra dollar. It's like their own version of a side hustle. Anyway, so we're always doing stuff like this. There's always ways for you to follow the content and the things that we're driving. We do webinars and white papers and blogs and talks at conferences, and we got newsletters and videos and everything you can possibly imagine. So if you're interested in this kind of stuff, you like threats, you want to learn what's going on the threat landscape, feel free to check out all the content. We probably have some time left. Does anybody have any questions? Yeah.
So we've seen a shift from Bitcoin to Monero. What's your guess or your prediction of what's the next hot? Could it be like coming into Ripple?
Whatever's worth the most money that they can make the most money off of. It's whatever's going to be the highest value. So if one cryptocurrency starts taking off that still has the same privacy, that's ASIC resistant, you're going to see them move to that. Or if for some reason something happens with the value of Monero crashing out, you could see them just replace it with something else. It's really around what's private, what can I do anonymously, and what can I generate the most revenue around. So it's kind of hard to say, considering we all know that cryptocurrency values are all over the place from a day-to-day basis. Other questions? Going once? Going twice? Ah, yeah. Yep. Yep. Absolutely.
Yeah, and we've seen some attackers try to like pop commodity boxes and mine Bitcoin, but that's just because they didn't understand math, right? But in cases where they know that there's a ton of system resources available, I could see the yeah.
We're talking some of the biggest supercomputers.
Yeah, yeah. Most of the time with these attackers, they're going for the largest pool of potential victims, and that's people with desktop computers, laptops, stuff like that. What organizations typically use? Yeah.
More likely to see live attacks because it's a concentrated big target instead of a diffuse group of small targets.
We have also seen them chaining multiple coins together, where they'll be mining Monero and they'll also mine Dash and they'll just drop like a ridiculously long string of various commands to keep it running to try and mine as much as they possibly can from a revenue perspective. Anybody have any other questions? Yeah.
So I like seeing the dollar figures with the putting a report for executives who only understand dollar figures. I've seen some other open source reporting that talks about just in general electricity consumption in terms of like kilowatt hours and CO2. Have you thought about reporting those numbers also to the field?
Yeah, usually when I talk about this, I bring that up, that the way that enterprises are largely impacted by this is from employee loss of productivity, hardware failure, because your hardware is not designed to run at 100% CPU 100% of the time. And the electricity thing is actually a really big deal. I mean, it may not affect you much if you're just popping a couple of desktops, but if you get one of those worms in there and it pops every server in your data center, you're going to be generating a massive amount of electricity. I mean, they say today, Bitcoin mining alone is responsible for using more electricity than the entire country of Ireland. So, I mean, it's bad and it's getting worse. The power aspect of this is going to continue to be a big, big part of the problem. Eventually, yes. Depends on where you live, right? That's why certain areas are so popular for mining, because electricity's cheap.
Better it's cold.
Yeah. Yeah.
How are you guys getting your samples?
We gather data through a lot of different ways. I mean, there's all kind. I mean, as far as like samples are concerned, a lot of it is either active exploitation. They're generally just using open source miners. So it's just an open source miner that's wrapped and delivered in some malicious manner, right? So you can gather stuff from email, you can gather stuff from honeypots, you can gather stuff from end systems. There's a plethora of different ways you can gather data around this.
Yeah, there's also a ton of public repositories if you're just looking for malware to like rip apart. So there's no shortage of samples for this anywhere.
Yeah, they're everywhere. Yeah. So that actually brings up cryptocurrencies in general, or this type of stuff? I mean, you could, but all that's going to do is make an adversary move, because there's new ICOs coming up every single day. So as long as there's currency there, they're just going to, if you shut one down, they're just going to jump to another one and jump to another one. As far as the actual botnets, though, we have seen them get quasi shut down by some of the pools. Some of the times they do it in interesting ways, like, hey, we have this massive botnet that's generating millions of hashes per second. We're going to shut it down by not paying out anymore. We'll take the CPU cycles, but we're just not going to pay the bad guys anymore. We have seen that a couple of times. Some are better than others. Other ones completely shut them off when they get reported. Any more questions? No? All right. Good questions. Thanks a lot, guys.
Thanks, everyone.